Hello and welcome to VarroStories. In this video I will tell you about the cozy horror story. The Inherited Watch. Lena is a quiet, solitary woman living in a small, minimalist apartment in the city, far from her family and any deep ties to her past. She works as a remote freelance writer, allowing her to decide when she wanted to be social and when she wanted to just stay in, read a good book and escape into her own mind. Lena had never been close to her Aunt Marjorie, but when the letter informed her of the inheritance, she couldn't bring herself to refuse. The watch was beautiful, an antique pocket watch, its polished silver casing engraved with intricate vines that seemed to shift and move in the right light. The hands were delicate, and the ticking was strangely soothing at first, like a heartbeat within the quiet of her apartment. She had no real attachment to it, but the idea of it, something passed down through the generations, a connection to the past, was compelling. It became a part of her nightly ritual, placing it on the bedside table before sleeping. But soon, the ticking began to feel oppressive. At first, it was just a soft background noise, a regular rhythm that never stopped. But then, as days turned to weeks, the ticking seemed louder, more insistent, and no matter how much she tried, she couldn't ignore it. Each night, the sound reverberated through her, filling the space between the walls of her room. She tried earplugs, white noise, and even sleeping pills, but nothing worked. The ticking would find its way into her dreams, burrowing under her skin. On the fourth night of her disturbed sleep, Lena awoke to the sound of the ticking growing louder and faster. It seemed to thrum with urgency, rattling her skull. She sat up in bed, heart racing, eyes darting to the source. The watch lay there, as still as it had been since she'd placed it on the table hours before. But now, its ticking had quickened, almost to the point of frenzy. Her breath caught in her throat. It was as though the watch itself had a pulse, something that could not be ignored. Suddenly, the room felt colder, and a shadow fell across the foot of her bed. Lena froze. The figure stood still, unmoving, yet the air around her was tense. Her pulse hammered in her chest as she strained to make sense of what she was seeing. There, at the edge of her bed, stood Aunt Marjorie. It couldn't be. Her aunt had died weeks ago. The woman before her was dressed in the same faded, flowing gown she'd worn at the funeral. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow, as though drained of all color. Her expression was not one of kindness or reassurance but of quiet, unnerving expectation. "Aunt Marjorie," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, the ticking growing louder, faster. It was a sound that pulsed in time with her racing heart. The figure did not answer, but her eyes seemed to bore into Lena, a deep, knowing look that sent a chill crawling up her spine. Slowly, the woman's mouth opened, but the words that emerged were not human, not of this world. "Your time is almost up." Lena's blood ran cold. She glanced at the watch, now ticking so quickly it seemed to vibrate. With trembling hands, she reached out to stop it, but before she could touch it, a heavy, invisible force pressed her back against the bed. "Don't touch it," the figure whispered again, but this time the voice was more of a hiss than speech. "It's too late." Lena's chest tightened, her breath growing shallow, and she tried to scream, but no sound came. The room seemed to shrink around her, suffocating her with its heavy presence. She tried to move, to escape, but her body felt paralyzed, as though the air itself had turned to stone. In the dim, flickering light, Aunt Marjorie's hollow eyes fixed on her. The ticking of the watch grew more rapid, more frantic. And then, as if in response, a soft, ghostly voice joined the chorus of sound. "Tick-tock, tick-tock," it whispered. "It's your turn." Lena's breath hitched, her limbs growing numb with terror. The air pulsed with the ticking, now so fast it was a blur, and in the heart of it, she felt the weight of something ancient, something that had always been waiting for her. The figure of Aunt Marjorie began to fade, but not completely. It lingered, her outline shimmering before it slowly dissolved into a swirling mist that seemed to absorb the very light of the room. And then, in the silence that followed, there was a new sound. The ticking had stopped. Lena's body moved again, and she reached for the watch, trembling. She looked at its face, expecting to see the time. It should have been broken. But there it was, ticking steadily, calmly, as if nothing had happened. And when she turned it over, she saw the inscription, faint but clear, on the back. Time is borrowed. Time is owed. Her heart stopped. The air grew thick with realization as the room seemed to darken, shadows creeping into every corner. Lena looked up. Aunt Marjorie's face now loomed in the reflection of the window, staring at her with an expression that was both sorrowful and accusing. And then, with a final, chilling echo, the watch began ticking again. Louder. Faster. It was her turn now. Lena's hand trembled as it hovered over the watch, its silver surface catching the faint light from the street lamp outside her window. Her mind was racing, but no thoughts could form clearly. Time is borrowed. Time is owed. The words burned into her memory like a brand, searing the very air around her. The room felt heavy, as though the very walls were closing in on her, pressing the coldness of her surroundings into her bones. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each exhale seeming to freeze before it left her lips. The watch sat there, mocking her. It was ticking now louder, quicker, more insistent, as though time itself was unraveling before her eyes. She tried to force herself to move, to do something, but her body refused to obey. Every muscle felt like lead, too heavy to lift, too stiff to control. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to run, to forget the watch and its twisted inheritance. But her feet remained rooted to the floor as if some invisible force held her in place. A faint movement caught her eye, and she turned, her eyes darting to the mirror on the opposite wall. The reflection that stared back at her wasn't her own. It was Aunt Marjorie again, standing at the foot of the bed, her hollow eyes watching Lena with a silent, knowing gaze. But this time, there was no mistaking it. The woman's mouth was moving, the words barely a whisper, but they echoed in Lena's ears like a drumbeat. Time is borrowed. Time is owed. It's your turn now, Lena. Lena's chest tightened. Her throat felt like it was closing, as though the very air had thickened, suffocating her. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words stuck in her throat like cold iron. The reflection of Aunt Marjorie in the mirror twisted and warped, becoming less human, more something other. The pale, lifeless skin stretched unnaturally, and the eyes were no longer hollow but blazing with a dark, burning fire. A slow, cruel smile spread across the woman's face, and her reflection tilted its head as though appraising Lena, waiting for something. And then the voice came again, but this time, it wasn't just Aunt Marjorie's. It was a chorus, many voices, all whispering, all urgent. It was a sound that came from every corner of the room, from the cracks in the walls, from the very floorboards beneath her feet. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Time is borrowed. Time is owed. You've waited too long. Lena's vision blurred, her hands shaking violently as she reached for the watch, now vibrating against the wooden surface. She didn't understand. What did it mean? How could it be her turn? Desperation took hold of her, and she grabbed the pocket watch, her fingers trembling as she tried to make sense of its inscription. But the words seemed to shift before her eyes, changing with every blink. Time is borrowed. Time is owed. It's your turn now. The sound of the ticking was now deafening, as though it was vibrating through her entire body. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and the temperature in the room dropped even further. The glass of the window fogged over with the chill, and as Lena's eyes caught sight of her reflection again, she gasped. She wasn't alone. A figure had appeared beside her own reflection, a shadowy form, its features hidden in the murk of the mirror. But she knew, deep in her gut, that it wasn't Aunt Marjorie anymore. It was something far older, far more ancient. Her heart pounded in her chest as the reflection of the shadowed figure seemed to smile, an impossible grin that stretched too wide, too far. Its eyes glowed with an eerie, unholy light. The voice that emanated from the figure was not one voice, but hundreds. Thousands. A cacophony of whispers, of lives that had passed, of souls long lost. Your time has come, Lena. Your soul is claimed. Time is borrowed. Time is owed. The room trembled with the weight of its words, the very air suffocating her as she tried to take a step back. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The ticking of the watch had become so rapid, so fast, that it felt like the universe itself was unraveling at the seams. Time. Her time was slipping away. With an effort she couldn't explain, Lena tore her gaze from the mirror and looked down at the watch. Its hands were moving so quickly that they were nothing but a blur. The face of the watch was no longer a reflection of time, it was a portal. A rift. A loud crack filled the room, and the air shimmered with a spectral force. The room began to distort, as though the walls themselves were warping around her. Lena's grip tightened on the watch, and for a moment, the ticking slowed, just for an instant. But it was fleeting. The rift in time snapped shut with a deafening crack, and the reflection of the shadowed figure was gone. But it didn't matter. Something was already changing. Something had already begun. Lena's pulse raced, her breath still shallow, as she stood there, staring at the watch, feeling the weight of it like a stone in her chest. And then, something inside her, something primal, something ancient, shifted. She knew, at that moment, that the watch had never been just an heirloom, never just a gift passed down from Aunt Marjorie. It had been a contract. A contract that had been signed long before her birth, a contract that she had no choice but to honor. She knew what she had to do. The shadows in the room twisted, the air growing heavier by the second. It was no longer just the watch ticking. It was the entire room. The entire world. Every second that passed was another second lost, and she could feel it. Her time was up. With trembling hands, she placed the watch against her chest. The ticking slowed, then stopped completely. For a brief moment, the silence was deafening. The room felt still, as though it had paused, frozen in time. And then, the ticking began again, louder than ever, faster, urgent. Lena closed her eyes, and as the clock struck its final note, the room darkened. The shadows encroached, and the weight of time, of eternity itself, settled into her bones. It was her turn now.